Good evening, and welcome to tonight's show. My name is Heather Fieser, and I'm the program manager for Looking for Lincoln, and it is my pleasure to welcome you. Tonight's show, A Slave's Path to Sainthood, the story of Father Augustus Tolton. Augustus Tolton was 9 years old when his mother spirited him, his brothers, and sister from slavery to Missouri to Quincy in the free state of Illinois. Even there, Gus, as he was called, knew discrimination and privation, even in Catholic churches in which he was educated and served. Discerning a call to the priesthood, Tolton found no American seminary willing to admit him. Trained in Rome, he returned to Quincy as the nation's first Black Catholic priest. Today, the Venerable Father Gus Tolton is on a path to sainthood in the Universal Catholic Church. Reg Ankrom's interest in Abraham Lincoln led him to Stephen Douglas. Numerous books, journals, magazines, and newspapers have published more than 100 of Reg's works in historical literature. He speaks frequently on Douglas and Lincoln and antebellum American history. For more information about Looking for Lincoln conversations, visit Looking for Lincoln's Facebook page. It is now my pleasure to introduce Reg Ankrom.
Thanks very much, Heather. I begin with thanks to you and to your executive director, Sarah, and the Looking for Lincoln organization for the invitation to be with you to speak tonight about Father Augustine Tolton, who became the first Black priest in the United States and today is on a path to sainthood in the Catholic Church. You will hear me refer to my subject tonight as Augustine. Today, he is referred more commonly as Augustus and Gus. I use his name at baptism, Augustine, and the name on his tombstone, Augustine, which was the name of the most important philosopher, theologian, and doctor of the Catholic Church, and African himself, St. Augustine of Hippo. Two cemeteries form a shroud around the small Catholic church at Brush Creek in rural Missouri. One is speckled with white limestone and granite markers, as pleasing in appearance as lilies of Easter, with names and places and birth and death dates etched into their faces. Kentucky, from which many of the deceased came, is engraved on many of the stones. In the second plot, memories are lost. There are no names, no dates, no places. Until archaeologists found the remains of mortals here, there were no markers. Today, the shadows of a few dozen small white crucifixes bless the graves as the sun moves across the soil where those bodies were found. They are the graves of forgotten slaves whose black hands worked the soil of some of the parishioners of the ancestor church to raise tobacco and grain and vegetables near there. In the wood frame structure that preceded this church, in this place, St. Peter Catholic Church at Brush Creek, Missouri, Martha Jane Chisley and Peter Paul Tolton were married in the spring of 1851. The woman, Martha Jane, was part of a dowry, part of what was recorded as a batch of slaves that Susan Manning received when in 1849 she married Stephen Elliott at her father's plantation in Meade County, Kentucky. Martha Jane Chisley's mother and brothers were not part of the Manning dowry and not with the newlywed Elliots when they took Martha Jane and the rest of their property with them to Rawls County, Missouri. It was only the Mississippi River that separated them from the free state of Illinois. The bustling city of Quincy was 35 miles north. On the Illinois side of the river, Quincy might as well have been 3,500 miles away. The Hager family, who owned the land that lay alongside the Elliots in Rawls County, had bought a black child, Peter Paul Tolton, at a slave sale in Hannibal, Missouri. Baptized a Catholic in infancy, he worked the Hager farm as a boy, planting, growing, and harvesting the grains of the fields, and learning how to distill them in Hager's primitive brewery and spirits distillery. It was Martha Jane's scream, which carried across the fields of the two slave properties, that brought Peter Paul Tolton running to the young woman. Peter Paul found her, rocking the limp body of a slave boy who had died of exhaustion working under the heat of a Missouri summer sun. In the days ahead, Tolton returned to look for Chisley, and in time their owners permitted them to marry as nature readorned the Missouri landscape in lilies and lilac that spring of 1851. In 1853, a boy, Charles, was born to the Toltons into slavery. The next year, on April 1st, 1854, Augustine was born, and in 1859, a girl, Anne, was born. As was the custom in Northeast Missouri, the three slave children were raised in the religion of their owners. The Elliots were Catholic, and they made Catholicism the faith of their slaves. Father John Sullivan baptized each of the Tolton children into the Catholic Church soon after their births. Father John's given name was entered on the birth record at Brush Creek as the second name given the second child, Augustine John Tolton. Of possessions, his name was the full extent of what Augustine John owned. Of things eternal, this was the full measure of the life of the 7-year-old boy in the landscape in Northeast Missouri. This was what the boy knew. People of his color were born, they ate, they slept, they worked long and hard, and they died. Their Catholicism did little to ease their earthly suffering, which came to them by only the circumstance of the color with which they were born. That was physical suffering. As he matured, Augustine John Tolton would also know an emotional suffering in his race, stings because of his skin, even in his own church. Tolton family history claims that Peter Paul Tolton, the boy's father, fled his owners to join the Union Army as the Civil War began in 1861. That African Americans were then prohibited from military service until 1863, among other reasons, make that unlikely. But it was known that the father Tolton had grown increasingly agitated that there could be no end to his bondage. Peter Paul Tolton fled Brush Creek, and Martha Jane and their children never heard from him again. Sometime after January 1st, 1863, the date of President Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation, which permitted the recruitment of black soldiers, Peter Paul Tolton did join the Union Army, and records show that he died of a disease several months later, and his wife Martha drew half his pension. In 1862, the threat of slave traders in Northeast Missouri compelled Martha Tolton to flee Brush Creek with her children. Her sense of duty in what she had to do had been informed by her separation a decade earlier from her own mother and siblings. Martha Tolton's efforts in the next days would be intensively focused on preventing her young family from a similar separation. With her children, she fled the Elliott place. Martha Jane was not known to have been to Quincy, but its reputation as a refuge for fugitive slaves was commonly known by that time. A group of Quincy men and women in August of 1835 had created the first anti-slavery society in Illinois, and the first of 3 major Illinois Underground Railway stations was organized in Quincy. In 1836, Dr. David Nelson, who had been forced from Missouri for starting an abolitionist school, Marion College, just north of Palmyra, fled to Quincy under a threat of death. He established the Mission Institute, another abolitionist school in Quincy. Students at the Institute were known to prowl Missouri to encourage slaves to flee their bonds. The state jailed 3 Institute students for terms of up to 6 years for doing so. A group of marauding Palmyrans burned down the Institute's chapel in Quincy in retaliation for the assistance the school and its students gave to runaway slaves. Rescued by a handful of Union soldiers when accosted by Confederate sympathizers while fleeing Missouri, the mother Tolton and her 3 children in 1862 made their way to Quincy. Here they joined other folks who had broken away from slavery. As enlightened as towns like Quincy might have been, it was common that blacks were segregated in Negro districts. Some 300 African Americans lived in Quincy's Negro district. The young Tolton family lived with Mrs. Mary Ann Davis, a widow, with her 9-year-old daughter, for several years, not quite a mile from the river. Each of the women worked, Martha as a daytime factory worker and Mrs. Davis as a housekeeper in a downtown building. Their staggered work hours assured that the children were looked after. Family tradition, as well as Brush Creek lore, is that the Elliots freed Martha Chisley Tolton and her children. Elliot descendants say Susan Elliot was close to Augustine John, serving as his godmother when he was baptized. The evidence indicates the Elliots did indeed let the family go. The Toltons became well known in Quincy, which would have made them vulnerable to capture. There is no evidence to indicate that the Elliots pursued them in any way. Within the year after they arrived at Quincy, Martha Jane, Charlie, and Augustine began work in the Harris Tobacco Factory in a busy manufacturing area on the city's southwest side. At 8 a.m. each day, the Toltons joined other African Americans at their stations, rolling wrinkled tobacco leaves into fine cigars from crops raised, harvested, and aged by slaves in Missouri. They worked 10 hours a day, 6 days a week, as stemmers, as they were called, cutting out coarse stems so that only the tenderest part of the moist leaves would be rolled. The older son, Charlie, always a frail boy, during the winter of 1863 caught a cold from which pneumonia developed. At 10 years of age, Charlie died. The Harris factory closed during winter months, allowing Augustine, now often called Augustus and Gus, to enroll in St. Boniface Catholic School. From their arrival in Quincy, the Toltons attended St. Boniface Catholic Church, which served primarily the city's large German Catholic population. The church sponsored a parish school, and Martha Tolton succeeded in enrolling son Gus. But the presence of the black child created dissension in the parish. White parents threatened to withdraw their children from the school and their membership from the church. Some circulated a petition to seek the bishop's removal of the parish priest. As a biographer wrote of the circumstance, adults can sometimes understand ignorance, but a 10-year-old child cannot. The boy's life was made intolerable. Children taunted him because he could not read, and they mocked his speech. In less than a month, his mother agreed with the parish priest, Father Herman Schaefermeyer, to withdraw Augustine John from the school. The family continued to attend masses at the church, but were found seated in a nook at the rear with a few other African American worshipers. There in that corner, Augustine quickly learned German and Latin. The corner supplied his only schooling over the next 4 years. There were 4 Catholic parishes in Quincy at the time. One, St. Lawrence O'Toole, founded in 1839. St. Lawrence's parishioners were mostly of Irish extraction, immigrant workers in railroad construction. Its pastor was Father Peter McGurr, a strong-willed Irish immigrant himself. McGurr was born June 29, 1833, in Fintona, Ireland. The people of his community, twice as old as the Universal Catholic Church itself, believed it the destiny of Peter McGurr, named for the apostle and rock of the church, to be a priest. McGurr's family was among the nearly 1 million people that famine and disease drove from Ireland to America between 1845 and 1852. At the age of 15, McGurr and 2 older brothers left Ireland, arriving in New York City in 1848. His brothers sent McGurr to Holy Cross College in Worcester, Massachusetts, and he did graduate work at a seminary in Montreal. In 2 more years, the McGurr brothers had saved enough of their earnings to bring the rest of the family to America. They chose to settle near Quincy at Bloomfield, Illinois, following several other Irish settlers into the thriving community. As most of the other Irish immigrants had been, the McGurr family were farmers. Ordained a priest at Alton Cathedral in 1861, Father McGurr was assigned to St. Mary Church in Pittsfield, about 35 miles south and west of Quincy. A few months later, he was appointed pastor of Quincy's St. Lawrence O'Toole Catholic Church. In that day, a pastor could name his parish church for his own patron saint. Father McGurr renamed his parish's Catholic church St. Peter, its name today. If McGurr had suffered privation in Ireland and a sense of loss by separation from his family, he could not know the suffering like the child whom he would serve as patron. Augustine John Tolton, by fate alone, had been born into a family of slaves in the slave state of Missouri. In free Illinois, he learned just as much about privation, insult, and intimidation. In 1868, Father McGurr was called to provide last rites to the daughter of Mrs. Davis, with whom the Toltons had lived now for 6 years. Gus Tolton was among those the priest found praying for the 16-year-old girl when she died of tuberculosis. McGurr learned that Gus for 2 months had been attending Colored School Number 1, a public school in a small log cabin on the north side of Quincy. The priest insisted that the Catholic teenager attend a Catholic school, and he arranged the boy's enrollment at St. Peter's School. At about that time, Martha Jane and Gus and Ann moved to the small brick dwelling in an alley behind the business district, a short walk from St. Peter Church and School. Teachers of the School Sisters of Notre Dame prepared the school's children for the arrival of the first black student. Although older and taller than his schoolmates, Gus found young friends in school, not so with some parishioners. The parish family had grown to 1,500 under Father McGurr's pastorate. While building his parish, he did his best to break down the clannish, nationalistic attitude of his parishioners and welcome non-Catholic, non-Irish families to the parish. Sister Carolyn Hemeseth, a biographer, wrote, McGurr's admonition that, quote, Christ died for all, and all included blacks, consoled his black parishioners and silenced others, Sister Hemeseth wrote. Gus continued to work at the tobacco factory and attended St. Peter's School for 3 months a year. In the first month, he memorized the Latin Mass and its prayers. He made his first communion and was confirmed in 1870. He became a sacristan, assisting the priest during the daily celebrations of the Mass before he went to work. Noting the piety of his young protege, McGurr asked Tolton about his interest in the religious life. It was the discussion that launched Gus Tolton's journey to the priesthood, a lengthy and difficult one, but Tolton had known few easy ones. Several local priests took up Tolton's cause. Father Schaefermeyer, whose interest in Gus continued, by this time had left to join the Franciscan order. Before he did so, he set up an account to assist with the cost of Gus's seminary training. Gus's own application to become a Franciscan postulant, a candidate to the Franciscan order, was turned down. Father McGurr made inquiries to seminaries throughout the country. Not one was ready for a Negro student. As a result, Quincy priests began Gus's education here. Father Francis Ostrop, pastor of St. Boniface, obtained a seminary study plan, and he and assistant pastor, Father Thomas Wegman, tutored Gus from 1873 to 1875. Father Wegman was transferred, and once again, Gus Tolton's future looked grim. In a few months, Gus went to work for the J.L. Kreitz saddle factory in Quincy and continued work as a janitor at St. Peter's. He also resumed his formation studies, this time under Father Francis Reinhardt, who had founded St. Mary Church in Quincy. At this point, Gus found a better job with better pay, hired by John J. Flynn at Derholt & Company, a soda bottling firm. Quincy in the late 1870s was home to about 3,000 African Americans now, some Catholic, most of whom who had stopped attending church. Father Michael Richard and Gus started a Sunday school at St. Francis Church. It grew so popular that it moved to an unoccupied former Protestant church that had been bought and used temporarily as a school and then closed by St. Boniface. Gus Tolton recruited children from the Negro district of Quincy. None of the boys and girls who started there in 1877 could read, and none of their parents could either. But Tolton told Father Richard that they would learn just as he had, by going to church, witnessing the Mass, and learning the sacraments. His zeal also carried Tolton into the temperance movement, in which he worked to end alcoholism. In 1878, when no others would do so, the Franciscans at St. Francis College, today's Quincy University, enrolled the 24-year-old Gus Tolton as a student. There, Franciscan Fathers Michael Richard, Engelbert Guy, and Francis Albers provided the education Tolton would need on his journey to become a priest. The search for a seminary in this country had failed, but petitions from Fathers McGurr and Richard to the superior cardinal of the Propaganda Fide, a seminary in Rome, which trained priests for mission work, did not fail. Richard wrote a detailed biography of Tolton and his efforts to get into a seminary and the reason, his race, he was denied. Father Richard described Tolton as a reverent acolyte, a devoted son, hard and faithful worker, diligent student, and zealous lay apostle. A reply took months, but when it came, it announced that the Propaganda Fide in Rome had accepted Augustine Tolton. On March 12, 1880, he arrived at the Piazza di Spagna, where his eyes would rise up the three-story building to see the face of his home for the next 6 years, the Collegium Urbanum de Propaganda Fide. All his classes, philosophy, theology, church law, doctrinal studies, all of them were in Latin. But he had been trained by Quincy Franciscan priests, and he was prepared. Ordained after he finished his studies, Tolton would be required to go to any country to which he was assigned. He expected to be assigned to Africa, and during his 6 years at the Propaganda, he studied deeply the African cultures and languages there. On Good Friday, 1886, the day before Gus Tolton's ordination, Cardinal Giovanni Simeone of the Propaganda told Tolton that the decision was to return him to his diocese of Alton and Quincy. He was shocked. He would return to the place where his first school had rejected him, where every seminary had rejected him, where religious orders had rejected him. Before the 20th century, the Catholic Church considered the United States a mission country, and the prefect cardinal knew of the many African Americans in the U.S. who needed evangelization. Cardinal Simeone said, "America has been called the most enlightened nation in the world. We shall see whether it deserves that honor. If the United States has never before seen a black priest, it must see one now." On April 24th, 1886, Holy Saturday, Gus Tolton, 32 years of age, was ordained Father Augustine Tolton. Cardinal Simeone arranged for Tolton's ordination in St. Peter Basilica, an unusual honor for a priest. The basilica is the burial place of St. Peter, whom Jesus commissioned to build his church. Augustine became Father Tolton in the place Catholics regard as the holiest of sites in Christianity. Now a Catholic priest, Father Tolton gave his first homily, as Catholics call the sermon in the first part of the Mass, the Liturgy of the Word, at St. Peter Basilica. Now 32, Tolton, now the Reverend Father Tolton, returned in triumph to Quincy on July 17, 1886. As the train arrived at the Quincy depot just up the bank from the Mississippi River, the river he and his mother, brother, and sister had crossed from slavery to freedom 24 years earlier, a brass band began playing "Holy God, We Praise Thy Name," Father Tolton's favorite hymn since childhood, and a large crowd at the station waved and cheered for him. Father McGurr had arranged for the new priest, Father Gus, to ride in a broom carriage pulled by 4 white horses to St. Peter Church. There, school children, Quincyans, Catholics and non-Catholics alike, and priests of the Quincy diocese welcomed the nation's first black Catholic priest. Father Tolton said the 9 a.m. Mass the next day at St. Boniface Church. His mentor, Father Peter McGurr, preached the sermon, the story of a black child's long and arduous path from slavery to priesthood. For 3.5 years, Father Tolton pastored St. Joseph Church, an African-American mission church of St. Boniface in Quincy. It was one way to separate black and white Catholics, but if that was the intention, it did not work. Color had no potency in Father Tolton's church. Still, controversy followed. Now it was the presence of those whites at St. Joseph, the cause. Whites joined blacks to hear Father Gus preach and to have Father Gus hear their confessions, grant absolution, and advise them spiritually. Masses at St. Joseph were standing room only for black and white. even some non-Catholics, and Father Gus welcomed them all. Father Gus had a purpose, but not one steeped in race. Because his black parishioners had so little for the collection, the priest knew that his poor parish would depend on the generosity of whites to help pay for the work of the church and his school. But trouble followed. Father Tolton felt the sting of racism he had known as a black child. This time it was from a fellow priest. The dean of the Quincy deanery, which made him something like the superior of other Quincy priests, Father Michael Weiss of St. Boniface, influenced Bishop James Ryan of the Alton Diocese to instruct Father Tolton to minister to African Americans only, to exclude whites from his church. Pledged to obedience to his bishop, this meant that Father Tolton had to find other ways to finance St. Joseph. To raise money for his church, he took distant speaking engagements to places like Washington, Baltimore, New York, Boston, Galveston, places where people were interested in hearing the first black priest. Still, Father Weiss was not satisfied. He suggested that Father Tolton go elsewhere. Tolton wanted to, but his vow to obey the Propaganda Fide's assignment to Quincy prohibited that. Under a siege of sorts, Father Tolton wrote to the cardinal at the Propaganda and pleaded for transfer. Cardinal Simeone exchanged correspondence with the Alton bishop, Ryan, who commended Father Tolton, but exposing his own failing, complained that, quote, he wants to establish a type of society here which is not feasible in this place, end quote. Cardinal Simeone permitted Father Tolton to go to Chicago to serve a large African American population that wanted him there, and Archbishop Patrick Feehan welcomed him. On December 19, 1889, Father Tolton left Quincy and St. Joseph closed its doors permanently. Father Tolton's mother, Martha, and his sister, Anne, accompanied him, Martha serving as his housekeeper. Father Tolton became pastor of St. Monica Catholic Church, to him an especially meaningful assignment. Akin to the persistence of his own mother, Monica brought a troublesome son to the light of the church. Today, we know him as St. Augustine of Hippo, bishop, theologian, philosopher, one of the great doctors of the early church for whom Augustine Tolton had been named. Father Tolton's work with the city's poorest Catholic population wore heavily on him. He made daily visits to the destitute. His work took him to hovels. He lived as his parishioners lived, in a home poorly furnished, and ate as his parishioners ate, simple meals. A priest visiting the parish priest's rectory reported that as soon as the evening meal was over, all were to kneel on the bare wood floor, and Father Tolton led prayers. It was evident to the visiting priest that Father Tolton was exhausted. Just before noon on Friday, July 9, 1897, with the temperature hovering above 100 degrees, Father Tolton got off a train after a conference of priests just outside of Chicago. He started toward his rectory. Witnesses said he swayed, then toppled to the sidewalk. He was taken to a nearby hospital, and doctors and nurses attended him through the afternoon. He did not recover. A chaplain administered prayers of extreme unction, his last sacrament, and he died that night. His mother, Martha, and his sister, Anne, at his bedside. In accordance with his wishes, Father Tolton's body was returned to Quincy and buried in St. Peter's Cemetery. In directing his place of rest, Father Tolton ignored the suffering he had known in Quincy. What was important was that this was the place of his first communion and confirmation. This was the place where he had learned prayers of the Mass and served as a sacristan. It was the place where he had learned forgiveness in the face of intolerance and discerned a vocation to the priesthood, where he had found good fathers willing to look beyond the only circumstance that made him different. His body was returned to Quincy on July 13, 1897, and laid in the ground of the place where he had known both tragedy and triumph. On February 24, 2011, Cardinal Francis George of the Chicago Archdiocese signed a proclamation for the cause of beatification and canonization of Father Augustine Tolton. It was a recognition of the merits of Father Tolton for sainthood in the Catholic Church, and a recognition that his life is a model of joy and faith, even in the face of long suffering. On February 13, 2012, the Sacred Congregation for Causes of Saints at the Vatican granted the title of Servant of God for Father Tolton, a second major step toward canonization, and authorized the Archdiocese of Chicago to begin an intensive inquiry into Father Tolton's life and virtues. Bishop Joseph Nicholas Perry, pictured here, has served as postulator of the cause of sainthood for Father Tolton. As part of the proceeding towards sainthood, Father Tolton's body on December 10th, 2016, was exhumed and examined for integrity. Numerous steps over the ensuing years have continued Father Tolton towards sainthood. On June 17th, 2019, Pope Francis signed a decree that elevated the Quincy priest status to the Venerable Father Augustus Tolton and advanced his cause toward canonization. The final steps will be the confirmation of 2 miraculous healings linked to prayers for Father Tolton's intercession in the recovery from certain death without medical treatment or other intervention. Bishop Perry, the postulator for the cause of Father Tolton's sainthood, has reported that more than a dozen possible miracles have been submitted. One under review is the recovery of a young priest who was in a coma and near death. Many prayers asking for the intercession of Father Tolton for the seminarian's recovery were offered. And then, on the date and at the time Father Tolton's remains were exhumed for review, required for the process, the young seminarian made an inexplicable, a miraculous recovery, and today he is a parish priest in Wisconsin. When that first miracle is confirmed, the Pope will beatify Father Tolton, and he will then be called the Blessed Father Tolton. The verification of a second miracle will make him a saint. If Father Tolton, let me rephrase, when Father Tolton becomes a saint, his shrine is expected to be at this church in Quincy, the city in which he discerned his call to the priesthood. This church, the descendant church of the first Saint Boniface, will be the place the city and the world will welcome a Roman Catholic saint home. Thank you.
Thank you, Reg, so much. That was really good. So everyone, it's now time to take your questions. So if you have not yet done so, please type them in the chat and we will try to get through as many as possible in the time that we have remaining. So Reg, I'm going to start you off with a question. So was it Father Tolton's wish that he be buried in Quincy, or did his mom and sister just decide after he passed away that's where he should be buried because that's where he was originally from?
No, Bishop Perry, who is the postulator of the cause for his canonization, has written that it was Father Tolton's wish that he be returned and buried in Quincy.
Okay. So here's a question from our audience. They want to know when you're going to write a book on this, Reg.
Oh, there have been some really good books written about them, and I love the books, and they've formed a lot of what I've just given you, along with some additional research, for example, from Father McGurr's niece, who has since died. She and I had lengthy conversation about Father McGurr's influence on Father Tolton. But Sister Carolyn Hemeseth wrote probably the first book, From Slave to Priest. And I want to compliment and recommend Father Roy Bauer, I believe, is the person who really got the entire cause started. He was the parish priest for several years, many years, here at St. Peter in Quincy. And he venerated the father who St. Peter, Pastor Peter McGurr helped, who the Franciscans helped. And it was Father Roy Bauer who really got this effort to start the cause of sainthood for Father Tolton, recognizing the suffering that Father Tolton went through, not only in Quincy, but throughout his life, wherever he went, physical and the way he was treated racially. So a lot of good books. He has a relative, a descendant, Sabrina Penn of Chicago, has written a couple of books, a children's book and others. And I have a few others up on my shelf here that I can't see from where I am. All good books, and I would recommend people read them. He had a remarkable life, and in my estimation, I've been devoted to his cause for 12 years. My estimation, a very worthy and venerable man who deserves sainthood in our church.
Okay. So here's the next question for you. Do we know what happened to Father Tolton's mother and sister after he passed away?
Yeah, she stayed in Chicago. She died. I think it was like 1888 or so, uh, and I'm not sure what the cause of death was, but she did die in Chicago.
That was his mother?
Yes,
Okay.
Martha Jane.
Okay. So when Father Tolton was in seminary in Rome, what do we know, like what like type of classes that he would have had? I know you said that they were all in Latin. Um
Yes, yeah. But in addition to the philosophy, the canon law, theology, and other classes, rhetoric, the other classes he had there, he was sure that he was going to be assigned from the propaganda, which was a mission seminary, trained missionaries to evangelize various areas. He was sure he would be sent to Africa, and believe it or not, he, in addition to knowing German and Latin, he he taught himself or was helped to learn 6 African languages and dialects. And there are very few people who know that, and I happen to know that. But he was so excited about returning to Africa, or going to Africa as a missionary. He was entirely shocked. He was surprised that the propaganda decided to send him back to Quincy. And as I said in the talk there, um, at the time he became a priest, the United States was actually a mission country. There was no established Catholic Church, and there was a great deal of missionary work to be done. At the time, the West was being developed, pretty well developed, but still there were people who were going west, and who needed evangelization, and the church sent Father Tolton back along with other missionary priests to help evangelize that area. And at the
Okay.
time, we were considered the West.
That's true. Quincy was considered the West back then. Hard to believe now, but very true um in those days. So what do you think, in all of your study of Father Tolton, what do you think is the most interesting thing that you learned about Father Tolton?
Um, I would say just his great quality of forbearance and forgiveness with all of the slings and arrows, and all of the terrible quotations, the language, and so on and so forth. Um, he was able to forbear that and forgive it. And to me, it's a quality that's well worth emulating. If we are to love our neighbor, we are to understand our neighbor. And Tolton was very good at understanding who they were who were criticizing or uh, damaging with the slings and arrows of race him. And I think that was his greatest quality, that he had this wonderful spirit capable of forgiving that kind of attack.
Okay, so here is another question. How long was, I mean, it's hard to tell, like in your presentation, I think you had dates, but I couldn't quite follow. How long was Father Tolton in Chicago before he tragically passed away from heat stroke?
Let's see. I think about 5 years, 4 or 5 years. Um, he did have some help. The church itself was, uh, again, because there was not a lot of financial support for his church. He got help from Sister Catherine Drexel, the daughter of a very wealthy American family, and she became a nun. She became a sister, and she was very generous in helping to support the effort he was making in Chicago. It was tough for him. Once he died, another priest was assigned, but it wasn't too long before he left. And at that point, the archdiocese made it a mission church, and ultimately, Archdiocese of Chicago closed it down. So St. Monica's was lost at that time. I'm not sure there's another St. Monica that's been established, but at that point, it was closed for lack of attendance and particularly for lack of funding.
Wow. Wow. So here's another question. So who supported Father Tolton? What was like, so like, I guess, how was he, I mean, obviously he lived a poor existence. But how was he financially supported? So was he supported by the Catholic Church, by the money that was given? Because you've already made a point, like there wasn't a whole lot of money that was being, brought in from his parishioners because they were poor. So can you enlighten us on how, back then he would have been compensated?
Yeah, he would have received a stipend from his own parish, and that obviously was part of the difficulty he faced. The parishes he had were not wealthy parishes, and so he depended on outside funding, and he did receive it. And when he was told he could no longer get that funding from White's and Quincy, that's when he started making trips and answering questions, answering invitations to come speak, and he would charge for it. And he would come back and use that money to support his work in the church. It was exhausting for him. I mean, he faced all kinds of troubles just trying to keep his institution open and serving his parishioners, trying to serve others. And he died at a very young age. I think he was 48 at the time he died.
Wow. It's just for me to think about, back then, all the traveling that he was doing. It was pretty daunting just to think of like traveling and going and.
Yeah. Of course, the railroads had started, and there was access by rail to these larger towns at that point. This was in the late 1880s. I was just looking at my notes here. He was 43 when he died. He was born in 1854 and died in 1897, so he'd have been 43. But the work he did, and just constantly on the go to try to, especially for a young man who was making an effort to support a parish who was Black, and that did not work in his behalf in many cases, in many instances. So he had to work especially hard. He was obviously hard. It wasn't like a parish where he'd moved in, it was established. He had to start attracting parishioners again. I believe when he moved to Chicago, there were something like 45 or 50 parishioners at the church, and he started building it up well. But it took time, and it took a great deal of effort, a great deal of influence and so on his part.
So was he much, okay, so in Quincy, obviously he had a lot of persecution and issues with the people who were in charge of him. In Chicago, was it better?
Yes, without question. And the reason I would say was there was more enlightenment, I would say, in his Chicago area than there was here, particularly with the dean of the deanery. If you're working for a guy who doesn't seem to like you, that makes it especially tough. The Archbishop of Chicago was very welcoming to Father Tolton because there was a large number of Black people who needed evangelization and needed a parish, needed a church. And what that would seem to tell us is that still, even in Chicago, there were other churches that may have been reluctant or unwilling to take on, Blacks at their church. But Father Tolton was able to get a lot of those residents in Chicago to his church. Unfortunately, it just couldn't continue to support itself once he died.
Yeah, I think he was probably, like, from what you said, like a very dynamic person, because every place he went, like, he attracted audience, like he attracted parishioners, he attracted people to come and hear him. And so he developed a following. And so when you lose that kind of a dynamic person, it would make sense, specifically that, especially if they brought in, instead of an African American, another white person to talk, that it would not have gone as
Yeah.
well.
What he found was there had been a number of Catholics here and in Chicago who were African Americans, but they had fallen away. I mean, they didn't sense the spirit, or didn't their spirit wasn't appealed to in the white churches. They just simply fell away. They started returning with Father Tolton, even as that child who, with Father Michael Richard, started that little school at St. Joseph early on, to teach kids to read and to teach them about the Bible and to teach them about the sacraments and so on. The kids started coming to that school, and that developed. And partly they returned when he returned as a priest 7 or 8 years later. So he was, as you said earlier, I think he was an extremely dynamic speaker. He had to be, to attract so many people. As I've read, even non-Catholics were interested in hearing him talk and would come back to his church. I do want to say that Father Weiss, that dean of the deanery who asked to move him away from Quincy, could have had an economic reason. I don't want to ignore the fact that he had just taken out a pretty large loan. At that time, it was $50,000 to rehabilitate St. Boniface Church in Quincy. And what he was seeing was the money that he otherwise might have had coming into his church going into St. Joseph, Father Tolton's church. That could have been a motivation. I suspect it was. I'm not sure to what extent. But just to say that there was more than just racism on Father Weiss's part, although I've seen the kind of language he used. I've read about it, and there was definitely racism on his part.
Okay. So here's a question. So Tolton is sent to Quincy, right? Mm-hmm. But then later he gets speaking engagements from all over the country. So this is the tail end of the 19th century, early, So there's a lot more communication, but like, how did people learn that Father Tolton existed? I mean, they didn't have Twitter, they didn't have email, they didn't have Facebook. How did people learn about this?
Yeah, well, there was the press was growing incredibly strong in the mid 19th century. Abraham Lincoln was probably the greatest, I'm not going to say manipulator, but user of the press. Stephen Douglas knew the power of the press, and the press covered Tolton very well. I mean, New York papers across the country carried the story of this first African-American priest coming to America. And so those of other communities who heard about him were interested, and he was attending. He had just gotten back from Bourbonnais, Illinois, which is about 30 miles south of Chicago, from a conference of priests in the Archdiocese of Chicago. He was coming back from there. There were people who attended who were not priests or not religious people, but members of the public who attended that meeting. It was a couple-day meeting, and so he was well known. One of the few, even at that time, as late as that was 1897, when that meeting was held. He was coming back to Chicago when he died. It was returning from that meeting. There were a lot of people who saw him, heard him. He spoke at these meetings, and I think made a good name for himself, which spread about this unique man who was a priest in the Catholic Church.
Okay. I have 2 more questions for you, and then I think we'll wrap it up. But okay. So when he came back to Quincy, it seemed to be like a huge deal, like lots of fanfare, and so I want to know if it was because so Peter McGirr was apparently like a huge supporter. So did he leave Quincy or something? Did he pass away and he wasn't there to help support Father Tolton? Or
no, he died in the 1880s. But I think you're right. It was Father McGirr who really stimulated the interest in this new priest who was coming to Quincy. In fact, Father McGirr was able to get 2 passenger cars to Chicago and took a good number of Quincyans to Chicago to escort, who rode back to Quincy with Father Tolton, and then had arranged for all of these welcomes at the train station, at the church. There was a parade, and Father McGurr really did a lot of that. So that interest in Father Tolton was going to be developed no matter what. But Father McGurr really got it off to a pretty good start with. He would have made a great PR man in this century, you know.
Yeah, he seems like he was super supportive. So when
He really was.
So the follow-up question to that is that when Father Tolton then eventually asked to be reassigned, had Father McGurr, like, was he gone from I guess that's what I'm trying to figure out. Was he no longer in Quincy? Had he gone from the scene, or he was not in a position where he could help him?
I believe he had died before Father Tolton was transferred. And I don't know the dynamics between Father McGurr and Father Weiss. You know, I'm sure there would have been many conversations, because McGurr was a great supporter of Tolton. But Weiss was also, in a sense, McGurr's boss too, as the dean of the deanery. So that part I really don't know. I'm sure there was a dynamic there that was important. I just haven't seen it.
Okay. Well, I would like to thank you for taking time this evening to speak to us about
My pleasure.
Father Tolton.
Thank you.
And this feels a little off topic, but we always ask, so I'm going to ask the question, because we always ask it on the end of our show. Why do you think, and I'm going to emphasize the times of Lincoln, but why do you think it's important to study Abraham Lincoln's life and times in the 21st century?
Abraham Lincoln is probably the most important American in American history. If our country has a single civil saint, I would say it is Abraham Lincoln. If you think about it, we're still a new country at the time Lincoln becomes president. His Illinois nemesis or antagonist, Stephen Douglas, was organizing the West, everything except Missouri, Louisiana, and Arkansas. West of the Mississippi was unorganized. It was Douglas who organizes it. It was Lincoln who had to find a way to keep the country together, including that really half a nation that Douglas and his compatriots brought in. Lincoln was able to do that. It took a civil war. Lincoln had a rationality about all of these things. His belief was that the South had a right to secede. They could secede if they got the agreement, if they got the agreement of all of the states that had organized the country beforehand. In other words, the nation was built on a contract of the states. And if the states all approved the nation, it would take the approval of all of the states of the nation to agree to allow the South to leave. And Abraham Lincoln fully understood those questions. His mind is what is just amazing to me, and the way he would look at things and discern answers. Just before the Emancipation Proclamation, he wrote a note to himself, and Roy Bosler, who has collected all his papers, called it the Meditation on the Divine Will. And Lincoln starts out by saying, there are good people on both sides of the war. They both pray to the same God, and we know God can't answer the prayers of both sides. So he ultimately believes there must be some other issue that is driving this war, that the great divine is imposing on him, Lincoln's God's instrument on earth. And so that's why I think we need to continue to study Lincoln. He is so multifaceted that we'll never find an end to the things we can learn about Abraham Lincoln.
Well, Reg, I want to thank you for joining us tonight. I want to thank our audience for joining us tonight. And
thank you.
I want to say good night to everyone, and we will see you next month.
Good night. Thank you, Heather.